Just as a public service, I'm not sure that we did this last week, and we should have, but reminder that these next 2 Sundays after today, and then certainly the Sunday after that, which is Palm Sunday, you might want to make sure that you remember to wear your comfortable shoes, because it's the long Gospels, and you're going to be standing a bit longer, so just, warn you now. All right, good, you're welcome. Now, what about this gospel? Well, as we go into the gospel, please remember the words that we sang as our response to the first reading. If today you hear his voice, harden not your hearts. Okay, let's keep that in mind. And we look at this woman in the gospel, and she's absolutely shocking. Her behavior is completely outrageous, unacceptable. Who does she think she is? Because in Jesus' time, the men and the women, for the most part, did not interact with one another. If a woman was seen in public talking to a man who was not her husband, and the husband wasn't anywhere around, that was grounds for suspicion. You didn't talk to the members of the other sex. In addition, because the men and the women didn't, mix or congregate at the same time, then where there was a town well, the women would come to the well and meet there either very early in the morning or late in the evening, and they would draw whatever water they needed for their household duties and requirements. And the men generally would come to the well, to the center of town, usually around noontime, middle of the day, so that the men and the women were avoiding each other. So why this woman, was coming to the well at noon, how brazen. She spoke to Jesus when he spoke to her. He asked for a drink. She said, "You're not supposed to be talking to me, and I'm not supposed to be talking to you, because you're a man and I'm a woman. You're a Jew and I'm a Samaritan, and we can't stand one another. You hate us, and we hate you right back." And yet she continues to talk to Jesus, and he continues to talk to her. Shocking, outrageous. And then after this long dialogue that they have, the woman leaves the well, goes to a group of men that are standing around, which she was not supposed to do, and tells them about the experience that she had just had with Jesus. And certainly the men were shocked. How dare you? Know your place, woman. You shouldn't be talking to us. But as we know in the gospel, they came to Jesus. Sure, they claimed it was on their own. and heard what he had to say, and they started breaking the social conventions as well. They welcomed a Jew into their midst for a couple of days. They showed true hospitality to him. But all of this stuff about the way things are supposed to be and the way things are not supposed to be, we pride ourselves today on being more open, more understanding or welcoming, and yet there are so many times and there are so many ways when we have no difficulty whatsoever judging others, whether it's individuals, whether it's a few people at work or in our neighborhood, or whether it's an entire group of people or an entire race, whatever the classification is. I was trying to think about it, and yes, racism is a form of being judgmental. But being judgmental is also not that far from being racist. Because in each case, why do we judge? Because there's something inside of us that feels insecure, whichever way you want to use it, good English or bad, I don't care. Something inside of us says, you've got to make yourself feel better about yourself. And so very often the way that we do it is I will look at someone else and I will judge them and I will say, well, at least I don't do that. Or at least I'm not that way. So I'm better than them. And we try to build ourselves up by climbing on top of others when it's our own insecurity. When it's against individuals, members of our family, other people that we see, people that we read about here on the news, we call it judgment. And as I can vouch for from the first couple of weeks, we bring it to confession, we confess it, and there it is. When we do that self-same thing against an entire group, then it's racism, or sexism, or ageism, or some other ism. And it's amazing. I don't hear people confess that very often at all. A man recalls this story. I remember the day I learned to hate racism. I was 5 years old. The walk home from school was only about 5 blocks. I usually walked home with some friends. On this day, I walked alone. Happy but in a hurry, I decided to take the shortcut through the alley. Without a care in the world, I careened around the corner, too late to change course. I'd walked into a back alley beating. There were 3 big white kids. In retrospect, there were probably no more than 6th graders, but they looked like giants from my kindergarten perspective. There was one black kid. He was standing against a garage, his hands behind his back. The 3 white kids were taking turns punching him. They laughed. He stood silent, except for the involuntary groans that followed each blow. And now I was caught. One of the 3 grabbed me and stood me in front of their victim. "You take a turn," he said. "Hit the N-word." I stood paralyzed. "Hit him or you're next." So I did. I feigned a punch. I can still feel the soft fuzz of that boy's turquoise sweater as my knuckles gently touched his stomach. I don't know how many punches there were. I don't know how long he had to stand backed up against the garage. After my minute participation in the conspiracy, they let me go, and I ran. I ran home crying and sick to my stomach. I have never forgotten. 35 years later, that event still preaches a sermon to me every time I remember it. One can despise, decry, denounce, and deplore something without ever being willing to suffer or to be inconvenienced to bring about change. If there's one thing that Jesus taught us, it was how to suffer with and for others. Jesus walked the way of the cross. He taught us the meaning of suffering as a servant. Perhaps my first chance to follow that example came in the alley by a garage 35 years ago. I don't know if that black boy from the alley grew up, or where he lives, or what he does today. I never knew his name. I wish I did. I wish I could find him. I need to ask his forgiveness, not for the blow I delivered, for it was nothing, but for the blows I refused to stand by and receive. I think that's what it takes. If you think back to the beginning of Mass, that prayer that we prayed, what did we say? In what I have done and in what I have failed to do. The racism and the prejudice in Jesus' time, he stepped beyond, even though it defied the conventional thinking. Today, during Lent, we are challenged. If today you hear his voice, harden not your hearts. We need to look and see how willing, how ready are we to judge, to put others down, to see them as something less than a child of God. If today you hear his voice, harden not your hearts.